In June 1944, the grey trucks rolled slowly through the narrow roads of Lincolnshire. Rain had fallen all morning, leaving the fields shiny and green under the weak sun. Inside the trucks sat 40 tired German soldiers, captured only weeks earlier in France. They wore rough brown uniforms with white armbands marked PW. Among them was Wilhelm Kraus, a 27-year-old mechanic from Saxony who had fixed tractors before the war. He pressed his face against the wooden slats, watching cows in wet meadows and stone cottages with red roofs. Everything looked calm, almost too calm. Back home, towns were broken and hungry, but here the world seemed untouched. Wilhelm felt confused. This was the country his officers had called weak and finished. Yet the roads were clean, the hedges trimmed, and even the air smelled of bread. He wondered what kind of enemies could live in such peaceful places. When the truck stopped at a small railway siding near Boston, the prisoners climbed down one by one. British soldiers with rifles waited beside a green lorry marked Home Guard. They were older men, faces lined from work, not the cruel figures the Germans had feared. Corporal Ernest Bailey, the guard in charge, spoke in slow English, using his hands to guide them. "You'll be working farms?" he said, his accent rough but not unkind. "Do your part, no trouble." The Germans nodded. A young interpreter repeated the words in clumsy German, and Wilhelm felt a strange relief. He could understand. They were given brown work coats and boots, each stamped with the letters PW. The clothes smelled of soap and storage, but they were dry and warm. For the first time since capture, Wilhelm felt almost human again. He looked across the flat fields stretching for miles, wondering what kind of farm would need prisoners to help. By the afternoon, the lorry bounced along a narrow lane bordered by hawthorn bushes. The air smelled of grass and engine oil. In the distance, Wilhelm saw a big red brick house with a barn behind it and several long sheds made of corrugated iron. A wooden sign at the gate read, "Whitaker Farm." Corporal Bailey stopped the truck and called out, "Right then, here we are." A tall man in a brown coat approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Thomas Whitaker," he said with a nod, his voice calm and firm. "I'll take 10 of them." He looked at Wilhelm's group. His eyes were steady, not friendly, but not angry either. Beside him stood a woman in a wool sweater, his wife Margaret, and a teenage boy with straw-colored hair named George. They all looked strong and healthy, their boots clean, their faces weathered by honest work. Wilhelm thought they looked nothing like the poor victims German radio had described. The prisoners were shown a long wooden shed at the edge of the farm, where bunks and blankets waited. Corporal Bailey explained the rules through the interpreter. "You work sunrise to sunset. No wandering, no foolishness. You'll be fed fair." The men nodded again. Wilhelm sat on the lower bunk, breathing in the smell of hay and oil. He could hear a steady humming sound from the yard. Curious, he stepped outside when Bailey wasn't looking and peered towards the barn. Inside, he saw something that made his heart race. A row of tractors. Not one, but 3. A green Ferguson stood nearest, its paint shining. Beside it was a red Fordson with wide rear wheels, and at the far end, a tall machine with yellow wheels and an American name, John Deere. Wilhelm froze. He whispered softly, "Dry Traktoren. 3 tractors." His mind could not believe it. In Saxony, even the biggest farm might have one, and that one often broken. Wilhelm stood there until Farmer Whitaker noticed him. "You like machines, do you?" the farmer asked through the interpreter. Wilhelm straightened quickly, nervous. "Yes, sir. Mechanic," he answered in slow English. Whitaker's eyes softened a little. "Good. We'll find you something useful to do." Then he waved toward the barn. "Plenty of work here." The guard called Wilhelm back to the shed, but the picture stayed in his head. 3 tractors, all working, all clean. It made no sense. How could one family own so much? That night, as the prisoners ate boiled potatoes and bread, Wilhelm stayed quiet. The others talked about escape, about Germany, about food. He thought only of those machines. They were like something from another world. He remembered the horses at home, the broken plows, the engines that ran on wood gas because fuel was gone. He wondered what else these English farms might hide. The next morning, rain had cleared, and a soft mist hung over the fields. The prisoners were led out to the yard where Farmer Whitaker waited with his son. The boy George smiled shyly as he handed Wilhelm a spanner. "Dad says you help fix things," he said slowly. Wilhelm nodded. His hands itched to touch metal again. The farmer started one of the tractors, and the noise made birds scatter from the trees. It sounded strong, steady, full of life. The smell of diesel filled the air. Whitaker shouted over the engine, "We'll be cutting barley this week. These machines keep us going." Wilhelm listened carefully, not only to the man but to the machine. The sound was clean, no knocking or choking like the German ones he knew. He wanted to ask how old it was, how many liters, what kind of fuel, but he stayed silent, afraid to seem too eager. As the day passed, the prisoners learned their duties, carrying tools, stacking hay, cleaning the yard. Wilhelm worked near the barn, eyes always drawn to the tractors. The farmer used each one for a different task. The Ferguson pulled a plow, the Fordson hauled a wagon, and the big John Deere stayed ready for heavy work. Even the farmer's wife knew how to start one. To Wilhelm, it felt impossible. Back home, machines were guarded like treasure. Here, they were simply tools, used and maintained without ceremony. During lunch, Corporal Bailey sat on a crate, reading a newspaper while the men ate bread and cheese. Wilhelm dared to ask, "How many farms have tractors?" Bailey looked up, smiling. "Most round here, lad. Some have 2 or 3. Government loans help." Wilhelm nodded slowly, though his stomach turned. If every farm had machines like these, then the English harvest would never fail. That night, Wilhelm lay awake on his bunk, listening to the wind outside. The air smelled of rain and soil. He thought about his father, who used to mend old engines by candlelight, and about his mother, who pulled weeds by hand. In Germany, food was rationed, people lined up for bread, and soldiers took horses for war. Yet here, even with sons fighting abroad, the fields were full, and the barns were alive with engines. Wilhelm could not understand it. How could England, under bombing and rationing, still look so rich? He turned on his side, staring at the wooden wall of the shed. He could hear faint laughter from the Whitaker house, the sound of a radio playing somewhere. It was warm, human, ordinary. For the first time since the war began, he felt more wonder than fear. The tractors were only machines, yet they whispered a truth he could not ignore. In the early hours before dawn, Wilhelm rose quietly and stepped outside. The moon hung low over the wet fields. The tractors stood inside the barn, shadows of metal and rubber. He approached the door and peered in again. The smell of oil and grease comforted him like home. He touched the cool fender of the Ferguson and whispered, "So strong, so many." He tried to picture how many such machines must exist across Britain, each one working while Germany struggled. His breath caught. Maybe strength was not only in soldiers and guns, maybe it was in machines that fed people and made life easier. When a rooster crowed, Wilhelm stepped back quickly, afraid of being caught. But no one stirred. He returned to his bunk, heart racing, knowing that tomorrow he would wake to the same strange peace. England was different, and he needed to understand why. Morning light spread across the fields as Wilhelm and the other prisoners lined up for work. The rain had stopped, and a cool wind carried the smell of wet straw and engine oil. Farmer Whitaker stood near the barn, giving short instructions through the interpreter. "You'll help with the machines today?" the man said. Wilhelm's heart lifted. He had been thinking all night about those tractors. Now he would see them up close, not just as distant shapes in the shadows. The guards watched, but didn't shout. The farmer treated the men like workers, not prisoners. His son George brought tin mugs of warm tea and smiled shyly before hurrying off to feed the chickens. Wilhelm felt strange warmth inside. It had been months since anyone had offered him kindness. As they walked to the yard, he noticed the ground firm under his boots and the sound of birds instead of bombs. Inside the wide barn, the smell of grease and hay mixed with the heavy scent of fuel. Wilhelm stopped in front of the green Ferguson tractor. Its paint shone like new leaves, and the black tires looked thick and strong. He ran his fingers across the metal fender, feeling the smooth surface. Beside it stood a red Fordson, older but still clean and solid. At the end of the row was the tall John Deere, bright green with yellow wheels, and the words "Made in America" on its side. Wilhelm stared in silence. 3 tractors in one place. It still felt impossible. Back home in Saxony, even big estates had maybe one machine, often old and patched together. Here, one family had 3. Farmer Whitaker noticed his look of wonder. "Fine machines, aren't they?" he said, smiling slightly. Wilhelm nodded, not trusting his English to answer fully. The farmer's pride was gentle, not boastful. Whitaker explained how each tractor had a job. "That little Ferguson's for ploughing, light and easy to turn," he said. "The Fordson hauls wagons, strong old thing. And the Deere, well, that one does the heavy work. We got it last year from the Americans." Wilhelm listened closely, understanding most of the words. His mind filled with questions. How much fuel did it use? How often did it break down? How did they get spare parts during war? But he kept quiet. The guard watched nearby, though not harshly. The farmer climbed onto the Fordson, turned a switch, and pressed the starter. The engine coughed once, then roared alive. Wilhelm stepped back, startled by how quickly it started. No hand crank, no smoke, no choking sound. It was like watching a miracle. Whitaker smiled again. "Electric starter," he said proudly. Wilhelm felt his throat tighten. In Germany, even officers' cars struggled to start in winter. By midday, the men were working in pairs, pulling tools, cleaning gears, and checking tires. Wilhelm stayed near the tractors, wiping dust from the metal with an oily cloth. His hands knew what to do without thinking. He checked bolts, turned levers, and studied how each part fit together. Everything was simple, easy to reach, and built with sense. He admired that. Back home, engineers built machines to show off skill. Here, machines were built so anyone could fix them. Corporal Bailey, sitting on a wooden crate nearby, watched him work. "You're good with your hands," he said, his accent thick but friendly. Wilhelm smiled a little. "Mechanic," he answered. Bailey nodded. "Figures. Whitaker's lucky to have you." Wilhelm didn't know what to say. It was strange hearing praise from the other side. He just wiped his hands and kept working, the steady hum of the engines filling the barn. That afternoon, the prisoners followed George to the lower fields where barley waited to be cut. The tractors rolled down the dirt path, the Fordson pulling a wagon stacked with wooden racks. The air buzzed with the sound of insects and the smell of warm grain. Wilhelm rode in the back, watching how the plough turned the soil in neat, perfect lines. It was like art, straight, smooth, without waste. He remembered his father shouting at tired horses, trying to drag heavy iron ploughs through muddy fields. Here, one man sitting on a machine did the work of 10. Even the other prisoners, most of them farmers from Bavaria and Prussia, could not hide their amazement. 3 tractors, one whispered. For 1 farm. Another shook his head. It's madness. But Wilhelm didn't think it was madness. He thought it was genius. These people had built peace with machines instead of fighting for land. When the work paused for lunch, Margaret Whitaker arrived with baskets of bread, cheese, and apples. She handed food to the guards, then to the prisoners. Hard work needs full stomachs, she said softly. Wilhelm took his share with both hands, whispering, "Thank you." She smiled, surprised to hear his English. The bread was warm, the cheese sharp, the apples sweet. It was a small meal, but felt like a feast. The men ate quietly under a tree, watching clouds drift over the fields. Farmer Whitaker sat on the Fordson wheel, wiping his brow with a cloth. "If we're lucky, we'll finish this field before rain," he said to Bailey. Wilhelm caught the words rain and finish and looked at the sky. He could almost forget he was a prisoner. For a moment, everything felt normal. Men working, eating, and talking about weather instead of war. He wished it could stay that way forever. After lunch, they returned to work. Wilhelm was asked to help check the Ferguson's oil line. The farmer crouched beside him, pointing at a leak. "See that? Small job?" Wilhelm nodded and used a wrench to tighten the bolt. The fix took less than a minute. The farmer seemed impressed. "Quick hands," he said. "You'll fit in fine here." Wilhelm smiled shyly. The trust felt strange but good. The farmer let him test the pedals while the engine idled. Wilhelm's legs trembled as he pressed the clutch and felt the machine move forward a few inches. The power beneath his boots felt alive, steady, dependable. He shut off the engine carefully and looked up. Whitaker clapped his shoulder once, then walked away. Wilhelm stood alone for a moment, staring at the Ferguson. He thought of home, how his village could change if they had machines like this. Maybe they'd never go hungry again. Evening fell slowly, painting the sky orange and purple. The prisoners loaded tools and followed the guards back to the barn. The tractors were parked neatly inside, gleaming under the dim light. Wilhelm looked at them one last time before stepping out. The barn doors closed with a deep creak, but the image stayed bright in his mind. 3 tractors, symbols of a world that worked differently. He walked to the wooden shed where the others waited for supper. The men spoke in low voices about home, about rumors of bombing, about families. Wilhelm said little. He kept thinking of the farmer's calm face and his quiet pride. The Whitakers worked hard, but never shouted. Their strength was quiet, built on steady effort. That night, Wilhelm lay in his bunk, feeling the tired ache of his hands and the steady beat of his heart. For the first time, it felt like honest work. Before sleep came, Wilhelm stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the distant clinking of metal. Maybe George was closing the barn doors again, or maybe it was just the wind. Either way, the sound reminded him of home, the clatter of tools, the hum of engines, the rhythm of a life that built things instead of breaking them. He wondered what his father would say if he could see these machines. Maybe he would laugh and shake his head, not believing such progress was real. Wilhelm turned on his side and pulled the blanket close. Tomorrow, they would return to the fields. Maybe he would get to start one of the tractors himself. The thought filled him with a quiet excitement. Outside, an owl hooted, and the fields of Lincolnshire lay still under the moon. The war felt far away. For the first time, Wilhelm dreamed of peace made by machines. The next morning began with soft sunshine breaking through thin clouds. Wilhelm woke before the guard's call, already dressed in his brown overalls. The air smelled of fresh hay and smoke from the farmhouse chimney. When the door opened, Corporal Bailey called, "Up, lads! Another fine day!" The men stretched and filed outside. Wilhelm followed George Whitaker to the barn, where the tractors stood waiting like faithful animals. The sight filled him with quiet joy. He wanted to touch the machines again, to feel their warmth and power. Farmer Whitaker entered with his usual calm steps, nodding to each man. "Let's keep the engines healthy," he said. "Harvest's coming soon." Wilhelm understood the word harvest now. He had heard it many times. It meant work, life, and food. He smiled slightly as he fetched the oil can and rags, ready to start another day among the machines he admired. Wilhelm's skill quickly showed itself that morning. One of the drive belts on the Fordson tractor had loosened, and the farmer asked him to look at it. Wilhelm crouched down, studying the pulleys and bolts. With quiet focus, he adjusted the tension and tested the belt with his fingers. The engine purred like a cat when it started again. "Good hands," Whitaker said, patting the fender. George clapped his hands in excitement. "He fixed it, Dad." The guard smiled too. Wilhelm felt a shy pride rise in his chest. He had not been called good for a long time. For the next hours, he checked fuel lines and cleaned spark plugs while the others moved hay. The farmer gave him space, trusting him not to break anything. It was a small freedom, but to Wilhelm it felt like a whole new life, working with purpose instead of fighting without meaning. By mid-morning, the fields shimmered under a pale sun. George showed Wilhelm how to grease the plow joints and check the air pressure in the tractor tires. They worked side by side in easy silence. The boy was cheerful, curious about Germany, and eager to learn some words in another language. "Wie heißt das?" he asked, pointing to the wrench. Wilhelm smiled. "Schraubenschlüssel," he said slowly. George laughed at the long word. "Too hard," he said, shaking his head. Wilhelm chuckled, the sound surprising even himself. For a moment, he forgot he was a prisoner. They were just two workers fixing tools together. Corporal Bailey watched from a few feet away, arms crossed, but face relaxed. "Not bad, eh, Kraus?" he called. Wilhelm nodded politely. "Not bad, sir." It was strange hearing friendly voices in English. The words no longer sounded sharp or cold. They carried warmth, like sunlight through glass. After lunch, the men loaded seed sacks onto a wagon. The tractors growled steadily, pulling the heavy loads without complaint. Wilhelm marveled at how simple everything seemed when the machines worked. In Germany, repairs were constant, fuel short, parts missing. Here, everything had a rhythm. The farmer planned each task like a song: plow, sow, rest, repeat. Wilhelm admired the balance. He began to understand why these people fought not for conquest, but for protection of their way of life. It was order without cruelty. When a fellow prisoner, Ernst, broke a handle on a rake, Whitaker didn't shout. He just said, "We'll fix it later." Wilhelm thought about how his own officers would have screamed over such a mistake. The difference was startling. British strength, he realized, was quiet and steady, not loud or proud. It was the kind that built instead of destroyed. That thought stayed in his heart all day. The afternoon sun turned golden, and the machines glistened with dust and sweat. Wilhelm worked on cleaning the John Deere's engine, wiping each bolt carefully. He studied the arrangement of pipes and cables, noting how clear and logical it was. Every part seemed built for easy repair, not for showing off. German machines were different, beautiful but complex, with designs that made even simple maintenance a struggle. Too clever for their own good, he murmured in German, smiling softly. The John Deere, by contrast, was like a friend, strong, simple, and dependable. Farmer Whitaker saw him leaning over the engine and said, "You like that one, eh?" Wilhelm nodded. "Very good machine," he replied in slow English. "Easy work." Whitaker grinned. "Aye, that's the point. No use having fancy gear if it breaks every week." The farmer's words echoed in Wilhelm's mind long after the day ended. Simple could be powerful. Later that week, the Fordsons' oil pump failed during field work. Whitaker called for Wilhelm immediately. "You've got the knack," he said. Wilhelm hurried to the barn, tools in hand. The guards trusted him now and didn't hover so close. He knelt beside the machine, removing bolts, checking the lines and cleaning the filter. His fingers moved with quiet confidence. After an hour, the tractor roared back to life. The men cheered softly, and even Corporal Bailey gave a low whistle. "You're a magician, lad," he said. Wilhelm smiled, wiping his hands on his trousers. It was the first time since before the war that someone had called him by a kind name. Whitaker gave him an extra slice of bread that evening and said, "Good work today." Those words meant more than medals. They meant respect earned by skill, not by rank or flag. Wilhelm slept well that night, proud and peaceful. As days passed, Wilhelm's friendship with the Whitakers deepened. George liked asking him about life in Germany before the war. "Did you have tractors there too?" the boy asked one morning while carrying milk pails. Wilhelm thought for a moment. "Some, not many. Mostly horses." George frowned. "Horses are slow." Wilhelm nodded sadly. "Yes, slow. Hard life." He didn't talk about how his father's farm had struggled or how the army had taken their horses for transport. Those memories still hurt. But watching the Whitakers made him understand something deeper. Machines gave freedom. They let people work smarter, not harder. He began to see how much of Germany's struggle came from trying to conquer instead of improve. Every turn of a wheel on the Ferguson felt like a lesson. He wondered if peace could ever come through building instead of fighting. Maybe this farm was showing him the answer. One windy afternoon, a small accident broke the routine. While loading hay, another prisoner slipped from the wagon and twisted his ankle. He cried out in pain, and the guards rushed over. Wilhelm helped lift the man, steadying him as Farmer Whitaker came running. "Easy, easy," the farmer said. Instead of scolding, he fetched cold water and wrapped the man's foot with cloth. "Rest tomorrow," he said simply. The kindness surprised everyone. In the Wehrmacht, injuries meant punishment or shame. Here, it meant care. Later that evening, Wilhelm sat outside the shed, watching the sunset over the wide Lincolnshire fields. The air smelled of cut grass, and the distant tractors stood silent, cooling after the day's work. He thought about what made men truly strong. Not power or pride, but the will to keep life going, even in war. He felt a calm he hadn't known in years. When Sunday came, work slowed. The guards allowed the prisoners to rest after breakfast. Wilhelm sat near the barn, carving a small wooden shape with his pocket knife. George approached, curious. "What are you making?" Wilhelm smiled. "Tractor," he said, showing the tiny wheels. The boy laughed. "You really love those machines, don't you?" Wilhelm nodded. "They make food, not war." The words hung in the air. George didn't know what to say, so he just sat beside him, humming softly. A few minutes later, Corporal Bailey joined them with a tin of tea. "You're fitting in well, Kraus," he said. "Not every prisoner does." Wilhelm shrugged. "Work is work, same everywhere." Bailey chuckled. "A wise man you are." The three sat quietly, sharing the warm drink as birds chirped overhead. For once, there was no thought of fighting, only the peaceful hum of farm life surrounding them. As dusk came, Wilhelm walked back to the shed, tired but content. He looked once more at the row of tractors resting inside the barn. The evening light made their metal surfaces glow softly. To him, they seemed alive, symbols of a world built on effort, not destruction. He thought about his father's workshop, about the sound of hammers and engines, and about how far he had come from the noise of war. Maybe the future could be different if men chose to build like the Whitakers did. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, the steady rhythm of this farm gave him hope. The fields outside were quiet, and the stars began to appear one by one. Wilhelm lay down in his bunk and whispered, "Tomorrow we work again." It was not a sigh of exhaustion, but a promise to keep learning from these machines and men. The next morning began quietly. The fields lay under a thin mist, and the sound of roosters echoed across the valley. Wilhelm rose early, his hands still smelling faintly of oil and hay. The camp guards moved slower on Sundays, so he had time to walk to the barn and breathe in the cool air. The tractors stood in a line, glinting in the soft dawn. He smiled at them like old friends. Soon, George appeared carrying 2 tin cups of tea. "Mum said you should have this," the boy said, handing him one. Wilhelm thanked him softly. They drank in silence while swallows darted above. Life had taken on a rhythm. Hard work, good food, quiet evenings. It was not freedom, but it was peace. And for Wilhelm, peace was something he had not known since before the war began. He didn't know how much that feeling would soon grow. By late morning, the prisoners were led to the big meadow to help with haymaking. The sun shone warmly, drying the wet grass until it shimmered like gold. Farmer Whitaker and a few neighbors worked alongside them, stacking hay into neat piles. Laughter carried across the field, mixing with the gentle buzz of flies and the steady chug of engines in the distance. Wilhelm worked with George, raking grass into rows. Margaret Whitaker walked among them with baskets of sandwiches and bottles of lemonade. When she reached Wilhelm, she smiled kindly. "You've earned this," she said. He took the food carefully, as if afraid it might vanish. The bread was thick and fresh, the butter melting under the sun. For a moment it felt like summer before the war. Simple, honest, human. Around him, the other prisoners laughed with the locals. No one spoke of battle or victory, only work and weather. After lunch, the group rested under the shade of an oak tree. The guards loosened their jackets, and even Corporal Bailey looked relaxed. He leaned against the trunk, smoking a cigarette. "Good work today, lads," he said, waving a hand. Wilhelm watched the smoke drift upward into the blue sky. He could hear bees and the faint clatter of tools from the farmyard. George sat nearby, carving small shapes into wood like Wilhelm had taught him. "What are you making?" Wilhelm asked. "A bird," George said proudly, showing the rough outline. Wilhelm nodded. "Very good." The boy smiled shyly. Around them, the farmers talked about ration books and the coming harvest. Wilhelm understood only parts of it, but he could hear no bitterness, only planning and patience. Even in war, these people built things. He thought about how back home everything was falling apart, while here, life still found a way to grow. That evening, Margaret invited the prisoners to sit behind the barn while she brought out mugs of warm soup. "You've worked hard," she said. The guards didn't object. Bailey muttered, "So long as they don't run off." Everyone laughed lightly. Wilhelm took a sip of the soup. It was thick with peas and potatoes, rich and comforting. "Gut," he said, smiling. Margaret nodded, understanding the word even without translation. The soft glow of lanterns lit the yard, and the sounds of the countryside filled the air. Frogs croaking, wind brushing the hedges, the gentle murmur of people talking about small things. Wilhelm felt the tension inside him fade away. He remembered the fear he had felt when captured, the harsh voices of German officers shouting orders. Here, nobody shouted. The Whitakers treated him like a man, not a number. For the first time, he wondered if kindness could be stronger than power. A few days later, the weather turned warm again. Farmer Whitaker asked the prisoners to help stack bales in the barn loft. Wilhelm worked beside 2 older men from the nearby village. They moved slowly but with steady strength, passing each bale upward like a rhythm. "Name's Albert," one of them said, offering his hand. Wilhelm shook it carefully. "Wilhelm," he replied. "Ah, Bill, then." Albert laughed. "Easier for us English tongues." The nickname stuck. From that day, everyone on the farm called him Bill. He didn't mind. It made him feel part of something. During breaks, Albert told stories about his youth, how he had once worked in a coal yard before buying his first cow. Wilhelm listened with quiet interest, amazed that a man could speak so openly with a prisoner. Each day, barriers between them grew smaller, replaced by shared sweat and laughter under the bright Lincolnshire sky. One afternoon, as they finished stacking hay, the sound of music drifted from the farmhouse. Margaret had turned on the radio, playing a cheerful tune. George and another farmhand started dancing in the yard, clapping their hands. Wilhelm laughed for the first time in months. Even the guards smiled. Bailey leaned on his rifle and said, "Reminds you we're still human, eh?" Wilhelm nodded. "Yes, human." The word felt heavy but right. When the song ended, Margaret called out, "Come everyone, tea's ready." They gathered at long wooden tables set up behind the house. Plates of bread, jam, and small cakes waited for them. The food was simple but filled with warmth. Wilhelm sat at the end, listening to the chatter around him. He didn't understand every word, but he felt the meaning. This was life, the kind worth protecting, the kind worth rebuilding. For a moment, he almost forgot the war. Later that week, a small fair was held in the nearby village to raise money for the Red Cross. Farmer Whitaker asked permission for the prisoners to help set up the stalls. Corporal Bailey agreed, warning, "Behave yourselves, lads." The village square bustled with people carrying boxes, banners, and flags. Wilhelm helped hang bunting across a wooden booth. Children ran past laughing, and women baked pies in the hall kitchen. The sight amazed him. "Even during war you have this?" he asked Bailey. The corporal smiled. "Life doesn't stop, son. That's how we win." The word struck Wilhelm deeply. In the evening, when the fair began, he watched people play games and sing songs. There was no hatred here, no speeches about glory, only joy. A little girl offered him a slice of pie, and when he thanked her, she said, "You're welcome, mister." For the first time, Wilhelm felt like part of a community. That night, as the prisoners returned to the farm, the stars shimmered bright over the dark fields. The air was cool, carrying the sweet scent of cut grass. Wilhelm walked a few steps behind, his thoughts full. He had seen something powerful that day, not in weapons or machines, but in the simple courage of people who kept living despite war. When they reached the barn, Farmer Whitaker thanked them for helping at the fair. "You've done well," he said, nodding to Wilhelm. "The village was glad to have you." Wilhelm bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, sir." The farmer smiled. "One day this will all be over. Maybe then you'll remember England kindly." Wilhelm looked around the quiet yard, the familiar shapes of tractors sleeping under the moonlight, and nodded. "Yes, I will remember." He meant it. The world outside might be burning, but here humanity still shone bright. As autumn neared, the days grew shorter, but the spirit on the farm stayed warm. Wilhelm worked harder than ever, wanting to prove his gratitude. The Whitakers treated him almost like family now. Margaret sometimes saved him an extra slice of bread or poured him a little more tea. George followed him everywhere, eager to learn new German words. "How do you say friend?" the boy asked one morning. Wilhelm smiled gently. "Freund." George repeated it carefully, laughing when his tongue stumbled. Wilhelm laughed too. Very good, he said. It was a small thing, yet it filled him with joy. Friendship was something war could not destroy. Even Corporal Bailey seemed softer, often humming while he watched them work. In this quiet corner of England, Wilhelm found something he never expected: respect, warmth, and a glimpse of peace that felt real enough to hold. It was the British way, steady, kind, unbroken. The cold wind of early August swept across the Lincolnshire fields, carrying the smell of ripe grain and damp soil. Wilhelm pulled his jacket tight as he walked toward the barn. The sky glowed pale gold, and a thin mist floated over the ditches. It had been many weeks since his arrival, and he now felt almost part of the farm. George greeted him with a cheerful wave. "Morning, Bill," he called. The nickname still made Wilhelm smile. Farmer Whitaker followed with a toolbox in hand. "The John Deere's acting up," he said. "Starts, then dies. Think you can look at it?" Wilhelm nodded. "Yes, I can." The farmer grinned. "Knew you'd say that." The guard, Corporal Bailey, stood nearby, sipping tea, more curious than cautious now. Wilhelm walked into the barn, rolled up his sleeves, and placed his hands on the green tractor's hood. "Let's see what troubles you," he murmured. He opened the metal panel and studied the engine. The smell of fuel and oil filled the air, reminding him of his father's old workshop back in Saxony. The machine was clean and well kept, yet the engine coughed weakly when he tried to start it. "Fuel line," Wilhelm muttered to himself. He unfastened the pipe and found a small blockage in the filter. With careful fingers, he cleaned the part using a rag dipped in kerosene. Whitaker watched silently, impressed by how sure the prisoner's hands moved. "You've done this before," he said. Wilhelm smiled faintly. "All my life." When the part was clear, he reattached the pipe, tightened the bolts, and tried the ignition again. The tractor started with a strong, steady hum. George cheered. "He's fixed it." The farmer clapped his hands once in satisfaction. "Good work, lad." Wilhelm nodded modestly, wiping his hands, but inside his chest a warm pride spread. When the sound of the engine settled, Wilhelm stood back, listening to its rhythm. It was like music, steady, confident, efficient. He turned the key, and the tractor stopped immediately, not sputtering once. Whitaker looked at him. "So what was it?" Wilhelm pointed to the filter. "Blocked. Very simple." The farmer chuckled. "Simple things cause big troubles." Wilhelm nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, simple things fix them too." Those words lingered in his mind long after the others left. He stayed behind to clean the tools and study the tractor more closely. He noticed how each part fit neatly, how bolts were uniform in size, how labels marked every section. In Germany, machines were built with pride, but little thought for the man who would repair them. Here, everything was made to serve work, not to impress. The idea fascinated him. Maybe power did not come from complexity at all, but from clarity. Later that day, Corporal Bailey joined him by the barn door. "You really understand these contraptions?" he said. Wilhelm shrugged. "I like them. They make sense." Bailey laughed. "Aye, more sense than this war." He handed Wilhelm a tin cup of tea. The two men stood in silence for a while, watching George drive the Fordson around the yard. "You know," Bailey said quietly, "my brother's in the army, somewhere in France. When he comes home, I hope he finds the world still working. Like this farm." Wilhelm nodded slowly. "Machines keep life moving." Bailey looked at him curiously. "Funny hearing that from a German. Thought you lot only cared for tanks." Wilhelm shook his head. "Tanks break. Tractors feed." Bailey grinned. "Can't argue with that." The words warmed Wilhelm's heart. It was the first real conversation they had shared as two men, not guard and prisoner, When evening came, Wilhelm sat by the open barn door, polishing a wrench. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. The tractors stood quietly, their metal surfaces glowing in the fading light. He thought about the machines Germany had built, the huge tanks with thick armor, the aircraft that soared like hawks, the rockets engineers bragged about. They were marvels, yes, but also monsters that consumed fuel and men. Here, the English and Americans built things that fed families and saved time. Their strength came not from terror, but from usefulness. Too much pride, Wilhelm whispered in German. Too little sense. He wondered if anyone back home would believe him when he told them. He imagined writing a book someday, explaining how the future belonged to those who built for life, not destruction. The thought comforted him more than any dream of medals ever had. The next morning, Farmer Whitaker asked Wilhelm to check all 3 tractors before the upcoming harvest. "Want them in top shape?" he said. Wilhelm agreed eagerly. He began with the Ferguson, changing its oil and tightening loose screws. Then he moved to the Fordson, cleaning its spark plugs and greasing the joints. Finally, he checked the John Deere again, running his fingers along the belts and valves. Everything about these machines spoke of order. Each model used similar parts, making repairs easy. It was as if someone had designed them for the common worker, not for engineers in white coats. As he worked, he realized the power of this idea. If every farmer could repair his own tools, the whole country could stay strong even during war. That was Britain's secret, he thought. Shared knowledge, shared effort. Machines here were not trophies, they were partners. It was a lesson he would never forget. By noon, his hands were black with grease, and his shirt clung to his back with sweat. George brought him water and a biscuit. "Dad says you've made those tractors better than new," the boy said proudly. Wilhelm smiled. "They are good machines, just needed care." George watched him curiously. "In Germany, do you have better ones?" Wilhelm hesitated, then shook his head. "Different. Too heavy, too many parts." The boy frowned. "Why make them that way?" Wilhelm sighed. "Because we like to show we are clever." George thought for a moment. "But being clever isn't the same as being smart, is it?" Wilhelm laughed softly. "No, it is not." He handed the boy a small bolt as a keepsake. "Remember that, George." The boy nodded seriously, tucking the bolt into his pocket. The simplicity of their talk filled Wilhelm with quiet hope for the next generation. That afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the sky, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The farmers hurried to cover haystacks and secure tools. Wilhelm ran to close the barn doors as rain began to fall. Inside, the dim light flickered against the metal tractors. He leaned against the Fordson, listening to the storm outside. The rain's steady drumming mixed with the scent of oil, and his thoughts drifted. He imagined Germany's factories under bombardment, workers hiding from fire, children hungry and cold. Here, even in storm, there was safety. He realized the war was already lost for his homeland, not because of guns, but because of the way they thought. While Germany had tried to rule the world, Britain had simply kept it running. The difference was everything. Wilhelm felt a tear slide down his cheek, hidden in the half-dark. It wasn't weakness, it was understanding. When the rain stopped, a rainbow arched over the wet fields. Farmer Whitaker entered the barn, wiping his boots. "All safe?" he asked. Wilhelm nodded. "All safe." The farmer looked at the tractors and said, "You've done good work, Bill. After the war, you'd find a fine job in this country." Wilhelm was silent for a moment. "Maybe," he said softly. Whitaker smiled. "Think about it." He turned to leave but added, "You've a good heart as well as good hands. Don't waste either." The door closed behind him, leaving Wilhelm alone with the machines. The farmer's words echoed inside him. A good heart, a good hand. He wondered if those things could build a new life when the war finally ended. He reached out and patted the tractor's hood. "Thank you," he whispered, as though the machine itself had taught him what strength truly meant. That night, the guards allowed a small fire behind the shed. The prisoners sat around it, talking quietly. Franz Müller, an older POW, asked Wilhelm what he thought of English farming. "Efficient," Wilhelm said. "Very efficient." Franz chuckled. "So the stories were true then? They live like kings." Wilhelm shook his head. "No, not kings, workers, but smart workers." He explained how the tractors were made simple on purpose, how spare parts fit across models, how even a boy like George could understand their design. The others listened with interest, some doubtful, some amazed. "They think ahead," Wilhelm said firmly. "That is why they win." The fire crackled, sparks rising into the dark. No one argued. The truth was clear in his calm voice. When the guards told them to put the fire out, Wilhelm felt lighter. Speaking the truth, even quietly, had given him courage again. In the days that followed, Wilhelm noticed how the lessons from the machines spread into everything he did. He began planning his tasks carefully, keeping tools organized, thinking about how to save time. Farmer Whitaker praised him often. "You've got the knack of making things run smooth," he said. Wilhelm answered modestly, "Machines teach patience." Whitaker nodded. "Aye, and men forget that sometimes." The bond between them deepened. The farmer no longer saw a prisoner but a fellow worker. Even the guards seemed friendlier. Sometimes Bailey would hand Wilhelm the newspaper, pointing to reports about battles in France. "Looks like it's nearly over," he'd say. Wilhelm only nodded. The news brought mixed feelings, relief for the world, sadness for his homeland. But when he looked at the tractors, shining in the sunlight, he reminded himself that endings could also be beginnings if men chose wisely. One quiet evening, as the sky darkened and owls began to call, Wilhelm sat outside the shed sharpening a spanner. George came running with a small book. "Look, Bill," he said. "I drew this." Inside were sketches of tractors, labeled with English words: engine, wheel, plow. Wilhelm turned the pages carefully, smiling. "You learn fast," he said. George grinned. "You taught me." For a long moment they sat together, watching the stars appear. "When the war ends," George said softly, "will you go home?" Wilhelm looked towards the horizon. "Maybe, but I will remember this place." The boy nodded. "Good. We'll remember you too." The night grew quiet except for the gentle hum of insects. Wilhelm closed his eyes and listened to the peaceful sounds of life continuing. Machines, men, and land, all working together. It was the revelation he had been waiting for all along. The sun rose early over the Lincolnshire fields, turning the horizon gold. It was the beginning of September, and the air smelled of ripe wheat and dry dust. Wilhelm stood beside the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Today, the harvest would begin. Farmer Whitaker checked his watch and called out, "All right, lads, let's make the most of the good weather." The tractors lined up in the yard like soldiers ready for duty. The Ferguson was hitched to the plough, the Fordson to the wagon, and the mighty John Deere to the combine. Wilhelm's heart beat faster as he climbed onto the Deere's step. The farmer nodded. "You can handle her now? Let's see what you can do." Wilhelm smiled proudly. "Yes, sir." With a turn of the key, the engine came alive, deep and steady. The smell of fuel mixed with the morning breeze. It was harvest time. The machines rolled into the fields, cutting golden rows across the land. The sound of engines filled the air, steady and strong like music. Wilhelm guided the combine carefully, watching the spinning blades slice through the wheat. The cut stalks poured into the hopper behind him, grain flowing like liquid gold. George ran beside the tractor, waving his arms, cheering. Farmer Whitaker followed on the Ferguson, shouting directions over the noise. Wilhelm felt a thrill of freedom behind the wheel. It was strange to think he was still a prisoner. At that moment, he felt like a worker among equals. When he looked across the wide fields, he saw endless waves of crops ready for harvest. He thought of his homeland, where fields lay empty, workers were gone, and horses pulled broken carts. The difference hurt his heart, but he couldn't look away from the proof of what industry could do. By midday, the first wagon was full, and the air shimmered with heat. The prisoners worked in teams, loading sacks of grain while the locals hauled new wagons into the field. Everyone moved with purpose and rhythm. Wilhelm coordinated the others, showing them how to stack the bags evenly so the wagon stayed balanced. Farmer Whitaker watched and smiled. "You've got the knack of a foreman," he said. Wilhelm didn't fully understand, but George translated. "He says you're a boss now." Wilhelm laughed softly. "No, just helping." The guard, Corporal Bailey, leaned on his rifle under a nearby tree, calling out jokes between puffs of his pipe. For a few hours, it didn't feel like war. It felt like teamwork, men and machines working for the same goal. The sound of the combine echoed like a heartbeat, steady and sure. Wilhelm realized this was the true power that won wars. Not guns, but unity. As the day wore on, the sun grew fierce. Sweat ran down Wilhelm's face, and his hands ached from steering. Yet he didn't stop. The combine devoured the field, line by line, until the golden wheat stood in neat stubble rows behind him. When he shut off the engine, silence fell except for the cry of crows overhead. Farmer Whitaker walked over, his hat tilted back and his face covered in dust. "Fine work," he said. "Couldn't ask for better." Wilhelm smiled tiredly. "Good machines," he replied. The farmer laughed. "Good man, too." That simple praise filled Wilhelm's chest with warmth. It wasn't the pride of victory, it was the satisfaction of doing something useful. He watched the sun dip lower and thought about the difference between destruction and creation. In war, men took things apart. On this farm, they built things that lasted. It was a lesson he would never forget. When they returned to the barn that evening, the tractors were covered in straw and dust, shining faintly under the dim lights. Wilhelm helped George scrape the mud off the wheels. The boy hummed a tune, cheerful even after a long day. "You never get tired," Wilhelm said with a grin. George shrugged. "We're used to it. Harvest is the best time. It means food for winter." Wilhelm nodded slowly. In Germany, harvest time was fear time. George frowned. "Why?" Wilhelm paused. "Because there was not enough. Bombs fell, crops burned." The boy's eyes widened. "That's awful." Wilhelm looked away, ashamed. "It is." George patted his arm gently. "Well, here, you're safe now." Those words stayed with Wilhelm through the night. Safe. It was a small word, but it meant more than freedom. For the first time, he believed safety was possible through work, not through power or walls of soldiers. A few days later, the sky turned grey and heavy with clouds. The farmers rushed to finish the harvest before the rains came. The tractors worked from dawn to dusk, their engines roaring against the wind. Wilhelm drove the John Deere with steady hands, leading the other machines across the field. The guards didn't even carry rifles anymore. They trusted the prisoners. Everyone focused on the same goal, saving the crops. When rain finally began to fall, the last wagon was already full. The men cheered as they rolled it back toward the barn. Farmer Whitaker stood at the gate, soaked but smiling. "That's the last of it," he shouted. Wilhelm laughed out loud, a deep, honest sound. George threw his cap in the air. Even Bailey clapped his hands. The storm raged on, but inside the farmyard, laughter filled the night. It was victory, not of war, but of work well done. Later, as the rain softened to drizzle, Wilhelm sat on an upturned crate in the barn. The tractors were lined up again, muddy but unbroken. He watched the droplets slide down their metal frames like tears. "You've earned your rest," he said quietly to the machines. Farmer Whitaker came in, carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. "Thought you might want this," he said. Wilhelm accepted it gratefully. "Thank you." They sat side by side, sipping in silence. Finally, the farmer spoke. "You know, Bill, when this war ends, the world will need men who can fix things. Machines, land, people. You'd do well at that." Wilhelm nodded slowly. "I hope so." The farmer smiled. "You've already started." Outside, thunder rolled faintly, but inside the barn, it was warm and still. Wilhelm felt something deep inside him settle, like a seed taking root in good soil. The harvest had changed more than fields. As autumn deepened, news began to spread among the prisoners. Germany was retreating on all fronts. Towns were falling, factories destroyed. Letters from home were scarce and full of sorrow. One evening, Wilhelm sat by the fire outside the shed, reading a crumpled note from his sister. Father's workshop gone. Mother safe but weak. Food short. He folded the paper slowly, staring into the flames. Franz Müller, sitting beside him, asked softly, "Bad news?" Wilhelm nodded. "Everything gone." Franz sighed. "Same for all of us." For a while they said nothing. Then Wilhelm whispered, "We were told we were stronger, smarter, but look." He gestured toward the quiet farm, the full barns, the healthy fields. "They built while we destroyed." Franz nodded, eyes distant. "Maybe that's why they'll win." The fire crackled softly between them. No one argued. The truth was too heavy, yet somehow it brought peace instead of anger. As the last weeks of harvest passed, the prisoners settled into a gentle routine. They repaired fences, stacked hay, and cleaned the barn. Farmer Whitaker trusted Wilhelm with more responsibility. Sometimes he left him in charge of checking fuel or organizing tools. "You've got a head for planning," the farmer said. Wilhelm smiled modestly. "Machines teach me." The farmer nodded. "And men, too." Even Corporal Bailey admitted, "Never thought I'd see a German running an English barn." Wilhelm laughed softly. "Neither did I." The laughter felt natural, easy. The guards and prisoners shared jokes now, even small stories about home. Wilhelm noticed something beautiful in this ordinary life, a kind of quiet victory that came from understanding, not fighting. When he looked across the wide fields, now bare and waiting for winter, he felt proud. They had fed a nation together. It was something greater than any battle ever won. On the final day of the harvest season, Farmer Whitaker gathered everyone in the yard. The evening sky blazed red, and the smell of smoke from the kitchen filled the air. Margaret brought out a tray of mugs filled with warm cider. "To a fine harvest," the farmer announced, raising his cup. Everyone cheered, guards and prisoners alike. Wilhelm stood among them, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. As they drank, George climbed onto a wagon and shouted, "3 tractors, 1 farm, and the best workers in England." Laughter followed, and Wilhelm couldn't stop smiling. He looked at the machines, their engines quiet, their metal gleaming in the firelight. They were more than tools now. They were symbols of what men could achieve when they worked together, instead of tearing each other apart. For Wilhelm, this harvest wasn't just about grain. It was the harvest of truth. That night, as the stars glimmered above the quiet farm, Wilhelm sat outside the shed one last time before bed. The air was cool and filled with the faint hum of crickets. He thought about everything he had seen, the tractors, the people, the kindness. The war might still rage far away, but here, in this small corner of England, he had found something stronger than hatred. He whispered to himself, "They win because they build." The words were simple but true. He looked toward the barn, where the John Deere stood resting, and smiled softly. "Thank you," he said to no one in particular. The machines had taught him more than his officers ever had. As he closed his eyes, the sound of wind through the wheat stubble lulled him to sleep. The harvest was done, but its lessons would stay with him forever. The autumn wind carried a sharp chill as the last leaves fell from the trees. The fields of Lincolnshire now lay bare, waiting for winter. One grey morning, a truck arrived at the Whitaker farm to collect the prisoners. The harvest was over, and their work on the farm had ended for the season. Farmer Whitaker shook Wilhelm's hand firmly. "You've done more than your share, Bill," he said. "If the army sends you back next year, I'll ask for you again." Wilhelm smiled faintly. "Thank you, sir." George stood nearby, holding a small wooden bird he had carved. "Here," he said, pressing it into Wilhelm's hand. "So you don't forget us." Wilhelm's throat tightened. "I will never forget." The guard, Corporal Bailey, nodded once. "Come on then, lad." As the truck rolled away down the muddy lane, Wilhelm looked back at the farm, the tractors, and the family waving goodbye. The truck drove through mist and rain for hours until they reached the large prison camp near Boston. Barbed wire fences stretched in long rows, and wooden guard towers stood like dark skeletons against the sky. Wilhelm had almost forgotten what captivity truly looked like. Inside the gates, hundreds of men moved about, carrying buckets, chopping wood, mending uniforms. The familiar smell of smoke, wet wool, and boiled cabbage hung in the air. A sergeant shouted orders as the new arrivals stepped down. Wilhelm followed quietly, feeling both older and calmer than when he had first arrived months ago. The guard at the gate handed him a small paper tag with a number. "Back to the barracks," he said. Wilhelm nodded. The building was cold but dry. He found a bunk near the stove and sat down heavily. Outside, the sound of the wind reminded him of open fields. The freedom of farm life already felt like a dream. The days in camp passed slowly. Work was lighter now, fixing fences, carrying firewood, cleaning the yard. The guards were not cruel, but they were distant. Wilhelm missed the Whitakers terribly. Each evening he thought about George's laughter, the smell of bread from Margaret's kitchen, and the steady hum of the John Deere. Around him, the other prisoners grew restless, whispering about rumors from home. One afternoon, the camp commandant announced that letters had arrived through the Red Cross. Wilhelm's heart leapt. He joined the line, waiting as the officer read out names. "Kraus! Wilhelm!" When his turn came, the guard handed him a thin envelope marked with German script. His hands shook as he opened it. The letter was from his sister, written in a hurried scrawl. She told him that their town had been bombed, their father's workshop destroyed, and their mother weak but alive. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. That night, Wilhelm sat on his bunk reading the letter again by the dim light of the stove. The other men were quiet, each lost in his own thoughts. Franz Müller, the older prisoner who often sat beside him, noticed his expression. "Bad news?" he asked softly. Wilhelm nodded. "Everything gone. My home, my father's shop. Only my sister and mother left." Franz sighed heavily. "It's the same everywhere. My village, too. Nothing but ashes now." Wilhelm folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "They said we were winning," he murmured. Franz gave a bitter laugh. "They always say that." The two men stared into the glowing coals. The warmth on their faces felt almost cruel against the cold inside their hearts. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the camp in a pale white blanket that made everything look peaceful. Even though it was not. As December deepened, the camp grew quieter. The prisoners worked less outside because of the snow, spending long hours in the barracks. One evening, the guards brought in a small Christmas tree cut from the nearby woods. The sight of it lifted everyone's spirits. "A bit of home," one man said softly. Soon the prisoners began gathering scraps of wood, cloth, and paint to make decorations. Wilhelm joined them, carving small stars with his knife. It felt good to work with his hands again, to create instead of destroy. Franz and a few others decided to build something special, a nativity scene for Christmas Eve. They worked in secret at first, using old crates and plaster. The guards eventually discovered their project, but didn't stop them. Even the British commandant came to see it. "Carry on," he said quietly. "The world could use some peace this year." Those words stayed with Wilhelm for days. By Christmas Eve, the nativity scene stood completed in the main hall. There were figures of Mary, Joseph, the baby Jesus, shepherds and animals, all shaped by hand from scraps of wire and wood. The prisoners gathered around, their faces glowing in the candlelight. For a moment, it didn't matter who was German or British. They were just men longing for home. A small choir sang softly, their voices trembling but sincere. Wilhelm stood near the back, clutching George's wooden bird in his pocket. The song "Silent Night" filled the air, and his eyes burned with tears. He thought of his mother lighting candles back in Saxony, of his father singing that same song before the war. He thought of the Whitakers, maybe sitting by their own fire that night. And he whispered, "Frohe Weihnachten." The words were for everyone, for those lost, those living, and those still hoping for a better tomorrow. After Christmas, life in the camp returned to its slow rhythm. The snow melted into grey slush, and the wind grew harsh again. Wilhelm began helping in the small repair shed where broken tools were fixed. It reminded him of the farm's workshop, and that brought a little comfort. One afternoon, while mending a wheelbarrow, he found a piece of newspaper used to wrap bolts. It showed a photograph of London at night, lights shining in the streets despite the war. The caption read, "Britain's Spirit Unbroken." Wilhelm stared at it for a long time. He understood now what made this country different. They built light even in darkness. That evening he shared the paper with Franz. "Look," he said, "they don't stop living." Franz nodded slowly. "That's why they win, Wilhelm. Not because of guns, but because of heart." Wilhelm didn't answer. He just folded the picture and kept it with his sister's letter. In February, new prisoners arrived, bringing fresh stories from the front. They said Germany was collapsing, cities reduced to rubble, soldiers surrendering everywhere. The news spread through the camp like a cold wind. Some men refused to believe it, others hung their heads in silence. Wilhelm said nothing. Deep down, he had known it for months. One evening, the commandant announced that work teams would soon start again when spring returned. Farmer Whitaker had already sent a request for workers. Wilhelm's heart leapt at the thought of seeing the farm again. The guard smiled when he saw his reaction. "Looks like someone has friends waiting," he said. Wilhelm nodded. Good people. That night, he dreamed of the wide fields turning green again, of George waving, of tractors roaring under the sun. When he woke, for the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of hope stronger than the hunger in his belly. The next few weeks passed slowly, but with purpose. The prisoners began preparing tools, cleaning sheds, and stacking supplies. Everyone sensed that the war was reaching its final days. Rumors of peace floated like whispers through the barracks. Wilhelm kept himself busy, fixing small machines for the guards and helping in the kitchen when asked. He found comfort in work. It kept the fear away. Sometimes at night he would take out his sister's letter and the photo of London and read them together. The two pieces of paper told the story of two worlds, one broken, one still standing. He didn't know which one he belonged to anymore, but he knew one thing for certain. When the war ended, he would build, not destroy. The lessons of the farm, the kindness of the Whitakers, and the strength of those machines had become his guide, his compass for whatever came next. As March arrived, the snow finally melted, leaving the fields beyond the fence soft and green again. The prisoners were allowed to walk in small groups along the inner path for exercise. Wilhelm stood by the wire one morning, watching the sky fill with birds returning from the south. The air smelled of earth and new life. Franz joined him quietly. "Spring again," he said. Wilhelm nodded. "Yes, maybe a new start." The older man smiled faintly. "You think we deserve one?" Wilhelm looked at the ground. "We have to earn it." They stood in silence, listening to the chirping of sparrows. For the first time, Wilhelm didn't feel like a prisoner looking out. He felt like a worker waiting to begin again. The war had taken much, but it had not taken his hands, his mind, or his will to build. That, he decided, was his greatest victory. April brought warmer air and the sound of tractors again in the far distance beyond the camp fence. Wilhelm could smell the soil turning under plows, the same rich scent he had come to love at Whitaker Farm. Each day, rumors grew stronger. Guards whispered that the war was almost over, that Germany was falling apart, and Hitler was gone from sight. The prisoners no longer argued about victory or defeat. They only wanted to go home, or to somewhere they could start again. Wilhelm sat outside one evening, watching the sunset paint the clouds pink. Franz Müller sat beside him, smoking quietly. "Do you think they'll send us home soon?" Franz asked. Wilhelm shrugged. "Maybe, but what home?" The old man nodded sadly. "Yes. What home indeed?" They fell silent, listening to the faint hum of a distant engine. For Wilhelm, that sound was the voice of peace returning. A few weeks later, the camp was buzzing with movement. Trucks came and went. The guards seemed less strict, almost cheerful. On the morning of May 8, 1945, the commandant called everyone to the yard. His voice carried over the wind. "The war in Europe is over," he said. "Germany has surrendered." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the noise began. Cheers, shouts, tears, laughter. Some prisoners cried openly, others simply stared at the sky. Wilhelm felt everything at once: relief, sorrow, and confusion. Franz clapped him on the shoulder. "It's done, my friend." Wilhelm nodded slowly. "Yes, it's done." That night, the camp was quiet again. Men sat around small fires, speaking softly about families, about what might come next. Wilhelm didn't join the talk. He walked to the fence and looked out at the dark fields. The stars above seemed brighter than ever. He whispered, "So this is peace." In the following days, British trucks arrived with supplies instead of guards with rifles. The Red Cross brought letters and news from home. Wilhelm received one from his sister, written in shaky handwriting. "Mother still alive. Town in ruins. We have little, but we survive." He read it several times, each word heavy and precious. That evening, the camp commandant told them, "You will be sent home soon, but some of you may choose to stay if you have sponsors." Wilhelm's heart stirred. Could that mean what he hoped? 2 days later, a familiar voice called his name. "Bill Kraus, is that you?" He turned to see Farmer Whitaker stepping out of a truck, his coat flapping in the wind. "Mr. Whitaker," Wilhelm exclaimed, almost forgetting his English. The farmer smiled warmly. I heard they might let a few of you stay. I came to see if you'd want to work with us again." Wilhelm couldn't speak for a moment. He had dreamed of the farm every night, of the fields and the quiet rhythm of work. "I would like that," he said softly. Whitaker nodded. "Then I'll speak to the officers. We can sponsor you. There'll be plenty to fix after all this." The guard standing nearby smiled. "You're a lucky man, Kraus." Wilhelm nodded, though his eyes filled with tears. "Yes, lucky." That evening he sat alone, thinking of his sister and mother far away in the ruins of Saxony. Could he really stay in England while they struggled? The thought tore at him, but another part of him whispered that he could do more here, learn, build, maybe even help one day when Germany rose again. He didn't sleep much that night, turning the decision over and over in his mind until dawn painted the sky pale gold. A week later, the paperwork was ready. Wilhelm signed his name carefully, each letter steady. The officer explained that he would stay as a civilian worker until he could apply for residence. "You've earned it," the man said kindly. Franz shook his hand before leaving for the transport ship. "You'll build something new here, Wilhelm," he said. "Remember us." Wilhelm smiled sadly. "I will." He watched the trucks roll away, carrying men back to a country in ruins. Then he turned toward the open road leading north, where Whitaker waited with his wagon. "Come on, Bill," the farmer called. "The fields won't plow themselves." Wilhelm climbed aboard. The wind smelled of grass and spring rain. As they drove, he saw English children playing by the roadside, their laughter bright against the grey sky. He realized then that this was what rebuilding meant. Life continuing, even after the worst storms. Back at the farm, everything felt both familiar and new. The tractors stood in their usual line outside the barn, polished and ready. George ran out to meet him, taller now, his face lit with excitement. "You're back!" he shouted. Margaret followed, smiling warmly. "Welcome home, Wilhelm." The words touched him deeply. Home. He had not heard that word in a long time. He helped unload supplies from the wagon and walked through the yard, noticing small repairs that needed doing. A fence leaned, a gate creaked, a wheelbarrow's handle was loose. He set to work immediately, his hands moving with sure purpose. It felt good to fix things again. That evening, they all sat around the kitchen table, sharing stew and bread. No one spoke of war. They talked about planting, weather, and plans for the future. For Wilhelm, it was the first true family meal he had known in years. As summer deepened, Wilhelm settled into his new life. He worked from dawn to dusk repairing machines, checking engines, and helping with planting. The Whitakers trusted him completely now. One afternoon, while tuning the John Deere, George handed him a letter from the postman. It was from his sister. "Mother passed peacefully. I will try to join you someday. Be happy, brother." Wilhelm read the words quietly, then folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. His eyes stung, but he smiled through the tears. He looked around the yard, at the fields growing green again, at George laughing as he chased the chickens, at the steady hum of life moving forward. His mother was gone, but her lessons about hard work and kindness lived in him. He whispered softly, "I will be happy, Mama." Then he turned back to the tractor, wiping his eyes and tightening a bolt. By autumn, Wilhelm had become known in nearby villages as the German mechanic. Farmers brought him tools to fix, sometimes paying with eggs or bread. He never complained. "It's honest work," he said simply. He began saving small coins in a tin box, dreaming of buying his own workshop one day. The villagers, once wary, grew to trust him. They saw his kindness, his patience, and his skill. Even Corporal Bailey, now retired from the Home Guard, visited once with a grin. "Told you you'd fit right in," he said. Wilhelm laughed. "You were right, sir." The two men shared a cup of tea, talking like old friends. England had changed him, not by force, but by quiet example. It had shown him that strength came from fairness and hard work. Every repaired engine, every greased wheel felt like another piece of his soul being rebuilt, stronger and cleaner than before. In the years that followed, Wilhelm's dream came true. With help from Farmer Whitaker and a small bank loan, he opened a workshop in a nearby village called Holbeach. The sign above the door read, "Kraus and Son Mechanics," a promise to the future more than a fact. He married Elsie, the daughter of a local tool merchant, and together they built a modest but happy life. George, now a young man, often visited to learn repairs. Sometimes, when Wilhelm looked out from his shop window, he saw the tractors passing on the road. Newer models, faster, brighter, but they still made him smile. Each one reminded him of the green John Deere that had changed his life. On quiet evenings, he would sit outside with Elsie, watching the sunset over the fields, and think of how far he had come, from a soldier in chains to a man free through honest work. One morning, many years later, Wilhelm walked out into his yard just as the sun was rising. 3 tractors stood there now, an old Fordson he had restored, a second-hand Ferguson, and a new bright green model he had saved for years to buy. Their paint shone in the golden light, and the air smelled of fuel and dew. He placed his hand on the newest tractor's hood and smiled. 3 tractors, he murmured, just like Mr. Whitaker's. Behind him, his young son, blonde-haired, curious and cheerful, ran out to meet him. "Papa, can I drive today?" Wilhelm laughed. "Not yet, Hans, someday." The boy grinned, running around the machines with excitement. Wilhelm watched him, pride swelling in his chest. The world had changed so much since those dark days, but here in this small English village, life had found its rhythm again, steady, peaceful, and full of hope. As the morning warmed, Wilhelm climbed onto the tractor and started the engine. The familiar hum filled the air, deep and steady like a heartbeat. Elsie stood at the doorway, waving with a smile. Wilhelm waved back, then looked out over the fields stretching wide and golden beneath the sky. The war was long over, but its lessons lived in every turn of the wheel. He had learned that power was not in weapons, but in hands that built and hearts that forgave. He had found his land of tomorrow, not through victory, but through work, kindness, and peace. As he drove forward into the bright morning, the tractors rumbled behind him, 3 shining giants in a field once touched by war. And in that moment, Wilhelm Kraus knew he had finally come home, to a world built not on conquest, but on hope everlasting.